feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie podcast. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck, alongside he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Matt, what kind of A24 fan are you?
I'd like to say I'm firmly Team Iron Man over Team Captain America. I think the Iron Man movies overall I've enjoyed more. I know me and you are Iron Man 3 defenders.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the first Captain America, I don't know. I like A24. I'm an A24 boy. I'm a little bit of a film bro. Although you got the film bro look going on today, because today we are reviewing Alex Garland's Civil War, not Marvel Studios Civil War, everyone. Eric's got the backwards snapback on and the red sunglasses from Civil War, looking like a Matt Rohrbeck clone, and I'm over here. I don't have a hat on today, but I'm wearing a Rizzo's House of Parm shirt, so basically an A24 shirt. Eric, what's going on? How are you?
Matt, not much. You know, it's the time of year where it feels like it's actually starting to get really busy. I know you're just finishing up school, and there's a number of big movies coming up that we will be reviewing probably on a more consistent basis. So we apologize for the Civil
That was a
War
slow
review.
start of but we have a great interview with you and Alex Garland. That was our main piece of content. So yeah,
Oh, absolutely. And it's nice to know. I was just going to say quickly, it's nice to know because I can't even see you that well, so I can't tell when your lips move. So I'll take these glasses off in a second. But it is interesting that, you know, week by week, movies are pretty disposable when it comes to studio fare. And
Yeah.
so the talking points get stale by the Friday after a new release. So by the time you get to the end of a new week, you're on to the next film. But with Civil War, it does seem to be picking up more steam in terms of the conversation and debates that are being had around the politics of the movie, the messaging of the film, whether or not it's propaganda. And it's a wide release. And usually a movie like this, because it's an A24 movie, it has an indie sheen to it, would be a platform style distribution release. And so with that in mind, it's just fascinating that even now we can still talk about this in the second week of its release, and you know, dissect it. And I think people are still interested in having that conversation because it is so polarizing.
Yeah, I think because of the political climate over the last, forever, but really the last 10 years or something in the US, when you're dropping a movie like this that, has the A24 logo, yes, directed by Alex Garland, but it is being released in IMAX theaters. It's probably A24's biggest release. It was marketed like it was a blockbuster. Like I'd say like it's accessible in a way that it isn't necessarily what you'd expect it to be based on the trailers, but I still think it's it's not as weird or off-putting as some A24 movies could be to, a quote unquote, mass audience or the normies out there. Not saying that A24 is even
What are you,
even
Michael
A20
Fassbender from The Killer?
A24 is even on the higher end of the, the more normal weird stuff you can get. And basically the blockbuster indie studio. So I think discourse is always going to be biggest when a movie's about to drop, or even the lead up to a movie based on trailers and what people think the movie might be. So I don't think it's a bad thing avoiding it that first week. Like ideally we want to get these reviews out on the day that they come out or something like that. That way we can be part of that discussion. It's just how things netted out, some technical issues, other things like that we weren't able to, but it's kind of fun a week later. Now we're going to do full spoilers. So at this point you've probably either seen Civil War, or if you haven't yet, we can give quick thoughts off the top without spoiling anything, and then we'll go immediately into spoilers. But we're pretty much going to cover the whole movie. And yeah, I think there is both a lot to talk about, and then also I think just based on the way that the movie sets itself up, where you kind of apply your own politics to the movie, and it's not really, it just drops you in and isn't really telling you what's going on in this Civil War, that I think a lot of the talk, yeah, I we'll get into it, but I mean, with any movie, like discourse, it's fun to have a conversation about something as long as people, but no pun intended, keep it civil. so so yeah, I don't know. Let's get into it though. Like we'll talk about it. We saw this movie a couple weeks ago now, and I think it's a good movie to sit and digest. You've now seen it twice, Eric.
Yes.
We don't necessarily need to go into the reasons why you wanted to see it a second time, or we can. It's up to you. But I'm gonna
No,
kick.
no,
I'm
it's
gonna.
not worth it.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'll kick it over to you first since you've seen it twice. First, like just quickly, spoiler free, do
Yeah.
you think it's worth seeing? And then immediately you can go into I'll actually kick it off by saying I really like the movie a lot. I'm a big fan of like dystopian kind of post-apocalyptic, even though that's not exactly what's happening here, but it kind of is. But very dystopian. And this aesthetic, I thought Garland, nailed it. Yes, we can get into, is the messaging kind of very simple, or is it just war is bad, or is it the apolitical nature of it kind of problematic and things like that? But I don't know. We'll get into that. But I do think it is very good, and I think you should see it in the theater. So I'll just kick it over to you after.
Yeah, I'm not as enthusiastic per se as maybe you are, Matt, but I still really appreciate the movie and would recommend seeing it because it is a film that is getting people to have a conversation afterwards. And any movie worth its time is something that you project on. That's the whole point of a movie like this, where you're watching it and you are looking at certain images that feel very much like they would happen in our world,
Yeah,
and not a multiverse. Like they feel, very much real to what has gone on in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of administration changes in the US, the online discourse, as you were mentioning before, but then even, the sort of unusual alliances that occur within the context of the film. And we'll get into that more. But I think on a technical level, and as what basically what Alex Garland does as a director and his collaboration with cinematographer Rob Hardy. The sound design is phenomenal. Everything
great
on
point.
that aspect of the filmmaking side of things, I highly recommend seeing the movie. Do I think it's Alex Garland's best film? No, I think Ex Machina still probably is my favorite because
I'd agree.
it felt a little bit more clear with what it was saying, and the self-contained nature of the story allowed for a more inventive sort of narrative to build. And Ex Machina even feels more sort of resonant now because of what we're talking about with
With
AI.
AI, yeah, yeah, for sure.
And so with this, there's a very much like, oh, this feels like, oh, we're, 2 or 3 steps removed from getting to this point. As Canadians, we're bystanders in this, but our currency is quite high, which is nice in this film. But when you're watching the movie, I think what I did struggle with a little bit is the message of the film and the apolitical, neutral nature of what Alex Garland is trying to say. Because I do think there are things he is actually quite critical of based on politics, and we'll get into it with the spoiler aspect of it. And to be honest, I also think that's a bit of a cop out because no movie that is ever made that points a camera and is telling a story doesn't have some sort of political
Yeah.
leaning. There's always something that the filmmaker or the writer or whoever is making a production, they have something to say. So that is inherently political. And so saying that and having that remove, I get it from the stance of a journalist because that's also an ethical question
I was
of,
gonna say, like, that's kind of what, following these war photographers is
but
that
even
that's
they
what
have, an opinion on
that's
things.
what
And
I
just
mean,
because they're
yeah.
behind a camera or,
Where they're
pen and
supposed to stay
paper.
neutral and just show it for what
Yeah,
it is. Yeah, there is gonna be a political leaning or some sort of moral, compass that they're trying to follow, whatever they believe in. Yeah.
absolutely. And so when you're looking at that as a whole, I just wish it was more pointed in its social commentary, because everything it's saying feels as though, you already mentioned it, the ultimate sort of takeaway is that war is bad,
Yeah.
and we could be, you know,
Heading in that direction.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I don't think it's on the level of, say, like something like Orwell's 1984, which really captured a very specific moment in time and felt like the repressive nature of, government, and, the people being sort of put into prisons and assimilated for the most part. It doesn't get to that. And even, talking about dystopian films, you have the Purge movies, which over the course of that franchise, the first Purge, not the first Purge, but the Purge, um,
Yeah.
was a great idea, but it didn't really deliver on its concept.
Yeah.
Where over time, though, you did see that franchise being more direct about its politics and what it was saying about the 1%, um, you know, justifying their means to kill, people of color and those that have a low financial sort of background. And so with that, like, it felt like, oh, it's actually, you know, saying something in that division. And I've even had conversations with people where the conversation is, well, Civil War, in order to get as many people to watch the film as possible, you have to be neutral, because you're going to alienate one side of your audience and not make the money. But I also
Okay,
call
Dwayne Johnson.
but I also call bullshit on that, because it's like the point of art, the point of,
Yeah. Is to
telling
say
a
something.
story is to be specific.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have to not compromise those feelings. And, if this was something from Universal or Warner Brothers or a company like that, I would get it. Or even like
Oh, it would
last
be
year,
more quote unquote entertaining, or it would
right?
just kind of sensationalize the whole thing
Well,
and
look at
try to.
Top Gun Maverick,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, look at that whole conversation we had last year with the geopolitics of
Yeah.
it, and the
Not wanting to
villain not.
name a country or whatever
But
like
you
that.
knew
Yeah.
it was either Iran or North Korea. It's
Yeah.
just that they didn't say it because they didn't want to alienate, a potential market for the film. So you keep that neutral. But that's a different type of movie. This
Right.
is something that actually
Can be saying something.
exactly,
Like,
and has an author's signature to it.
yeah, but the bigger, A24 had that whole thing come out saying that they want to make bigger movies and they want to get into blockbusters. So I think they're trying to thread the needle there of, like, finding that sweet spot of both being an A24 movie and having, a vision and a feel to it, and saying something, but then also trying to reach the biggest audience, possible, and maybe that watered down the movie a little bit. Like, I'm actually okay with the movie, not necessarily having like a firm stance one way or another, because I think taking it and dropping you in and letting the audience apply their own politics to it, I think is kind of interesting. And I think the movie is haunting. I agree with you with a lot of what you said on the technical side. I think that's where the movie really, really shines in its sets and its set pieces. And it's not an action movie, but there is a lot of action, and the sound design really scares the shit out of you. Like, gunshots are intense. The Jesse Plemons scene, we can get into full spoilers now too. The Jesse Plemons sequence is one of the most disturbing, tense, 5 to 10 minute sequences I've seen in a movie in a long time. It's very much a horror movie, and I think just, trying to go, okay, imagine this is the world. Like you said, it's not a superhero universe. It's not whatever. It's not a futuristic. It's literally could be happening, a year from now, and dropping you in and going, this is the real world. Texas and California are united. You don't know why. You just know that there's this, president who's a dictator and he's on his third term, and you can just kind of apply your own shit to it. And then just the visuals, I think, are what stand out, and applying, I'm sure a ton of research was done, and talking to war photographers and looking at footage and studying civil wars and wars in other countries. And I think, I just found it very fascinating to watch because I like that imagery. I find it really kind of interesting of just, holy shit, how this could happen, but I can't even fathom it happening in the United States, even though it could easily happen. But this happens in Europe and other countries all around the world where wars start, and and just applying that to an American lens, I think was fascinating in the politics going on right now. Of like the US has been involved in so many wars around the world. They've sent troops to all these different places, and there has been American soldiers walking down the streets of these cities all across the planet. And I think just seeing that in these locations that you've either been to or you've seen in movies before, and then just following like a war photographer that would be going to, again, capture a war in any other country, but having that be in the US. I know it's very simple and I know it's surface level almost. Um, but I just found it disturbing, the imagery and this story, and just like going, holy fuck, this could happen. And I think it's just like a what if scenario. Sorry to keep going back to like Marvel puns and shit like that. But like, I just, it was both thoroughly entertaining, extremely like haunting, some of it intense at times. I have problems with, and I think we both are on the same page here with some of the plot and story elements, like
And dialogue.
like it's we're going to talk about challengers soon, and it's two things. They do similar things in screenwriters. I think it's a very classic movie thing that we talk about all the time, of just bringing things back in the third act, or whatever, Chekhov's gun and all this other shit you can talk about in screenwriting and stuff. But there's a way to do it that feels like it's a great payoff, and then there's a way to do it that just feels like lazy and kind of like eye rolly. And I feel like this falls more in the eye rolly category than the satisfying payoff category. Like when you even have your main character, named Lee Smith, who and is named, I actually thought her name was Lee Miller, but like they
Well,
didn't
Lee
go
Miller
that
is the
far. I
photographer.
know,
Yeah.
but just Lee being the name,
Yeah.
I guess that's better, because at first I was like, wait, is her name Lee Miller in the movie? Because that would be too much. But even them like referencing it and talking about it, I was just like, that's the kind of writing that I was just like, I don't know. And then like when you get into the end, we're going full spoilers, everyone. Sorry, I'm going to jump around. And you have that moment with Kirsten Dunst at the end when she gets shot in front of Kaylee Spaney's character
Jesse.
and Jesse. And it just feels so overwrought, and it's just to the point where it kind of pulls you out of it, where these things are discussed earlier in the movies and are set up so obviously that you just kind of wish they were a bit more clever in their storytelling or their writing. So I
It
think
doesn't feel
that's
natural. Like, that's the
no.
problem with it,
It
because
feels like a movie at the
yes,
end, where
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't. Sorry, one more point.
Yeah, sure.
When you talked about how this feels like it's dropping you into reality, that's what rips you out of that reality and makes you go, "Oh, I'm not in the actual world. I'm in a
A
movie, or I'm
movie.
watching a movie," right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of shit, like, I think it would have been way, and I know this is when you're critiquing something, you can't play backdoor screenwriter or filmmaker or anything like that. When you go, well, the movie didn't, I wish it did this. It's not necessarily I wish. It's just like, I think there's more interesting ways you could have been surprising and say like, war is awful and can take a life away in any moment. And they do that with other characters, but to me, it would have been even interesting if you're going to kill off that character, just like have it be done halfway through the movie randomly and shockingly. Like, it felt so set up that it was just kind of like by the end you're like, all right, I'm watching a movie now, and this is, I feel like, a stage play or something like that that's a little over the top. But overall, I mean, I still do think it's haunting. There's some great imagery. The fucking sound design, if you see it in IMAX or something like that, or Dolby with Dolby Atmos, like it's jarring, like to the point where you'll jump multiple times based on gunshots and stuff like that. Like, it's an intense movie, but I think the script, it falls apart a little bit. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to make, because you have the scene with Jesse Plemons where you feel like you don't know what's going to
Yeah.
happen, and it's so intense in terms of how things are playing out, and there's nothing from a previous scene that can help you or comfort you, because you're going back in your mind, you're thinking, oh, is there a reference to this or something in terms of how they were talking about it, because there's a lot of conversations, in the road trip style of narrative structure that Garland is using here, where it's meant to meander a little bit as they go from New York into Pittsburgh into West Virginia and then to DC. And so when you have these characters that are getting to know each other a little bit in the car, obviously Kristen Dunst's character Lee knows Stephen McKinley Henderson's Sammy, and Sammy's a bit of a mentor. And then you have uh why am I forgetting his name now, Wagner Mora,
Yeah.
as Joel, who is a bit of like, you kind of see it in that conversation that they have in New York at the beginning, that he's a bit of an adrenaline junkie. He's seeking, the story, and wants to be the one to get that quote from the president, because Nick Offerson's third term president, who is, considered a fascist and has used airstrikes on his own people, and continues to, not surrender to the rest of the world. There's that conversation that you mentioned already with Western forces, with
Yeah.
Texas and California creating an alliance. The conversations that these four characters have on their trip, a lot of it plays out through the conversation, especially the way that Stephen McKinley Henderson's character talks about how you're never going to, you know, be satisfied, or the evilness that you've built up in your head of this dictator
Yeah.
never, it's never the same when you meet them. They're just a sad, pathetic human being that is
Yeah.
begging for their life. And what happens? You have Nick Offerman's character at the end begging for his life, looking like Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
And so with that, it's like that payoff, that setup and payoff is subtle, because it's something where it's just almost anecdotal in conversation, where history repeats itself.
Yeah.
These, tyrants are always, they're horrible people. And when they're in power, they act as though they're gods. But then when they're taken down, they revert back to being, this sort of sad, innocent, fragile person that needs help. And that's what happens with this. And when you're watching, it's like that I appreciated. Or the conversations that they have, about these characters and how they look at dehumanization, as I as I get the thumbs up. The conversations about how people see each other in wartime. Those are conversations that are worthwhile, and I think they're provocative and they have something to say. But then you have that whole conversation with, Dunst and Spaney's characters talking about, well, if I died, would you take my photograph? And as soon as that conversation happens, you're like, okay, one of these two is going to die. This is foreshadowing. And one of them is going to take the other one's photo as they die, or when they're dead. And what happens? Well, Kirsten Dunst dies in the final act, partly because Kaylee Spaney's Jessie is somewhat reckless in the moment, and has, her experiences is that she has been able to get out of difficult situations every time. So she's willing to take, I think, a greater risk, where Dunst is more experienced and knows the danger that's in front of her, and also being, desensitized and hardened by it all, and maybe getting a little bit of her humanity back in the third act in terms of a redemption storyline. You see how Dunst is more careful because she's had more experiences, as we see in certain moments of not flashbacks, but thoughts of her own sort of journey through photography, and her being this sort of big name photographer. They talk about, then this is another eye rolling thing, where like I just think it's not very creative in terms of what they're calling it, the Antifa massacre, where it's just like, okay, call it something else. It's not so obvious. And that's where like the shallowness of it as well comes into play a little bit. But what we were talking about before with the sound design and it being almost like a jump scare, there's a moment in the movie where it's a bit of downtime where they're kind of just parked out in this almost it looks like a parking lot, maybe near a train station, and there's a firefight going on a
In
little
the
ways
background,
away,
yeah.
but it's mostly quiet. There's not even really much score. And then you have a moment where Dunst is kind of like, looking off in the distance, and then it does a hard cut to gunfire as a raid is going on. And the intensity of the bullets being fired and also the impact that those bullets have. This is something I asked Garland in the interview about how you portray violence in film. You actually see what a bullet can do to a human body
Yeah,
in this. And I think that's also important because in a lot of these movies, something like The Purge, where I think, I was giving The Purge a little bit more credit early on about its politics being a little bit more clear. The Purge is also an exploitation movie and
sure.
it's more genre oriented. So you have blood and guts and people being, ripped apart in various ways for entertainment, where this doesn't approach, violence and executions and death in the same manner. And I think that's also very important to not only this type of narrative, but how you handle it within the context of telling a story that's about politics, that's about division, that's
And
about
war,
war.
yeah, exactly. And it shows you the ramifications of war, right? And what it can do to a person, to a country, an area. And I think that's it when you break it down into like the little set pieces of the movie. Like that's what I keep thinking about. You have that Christmas fair sequence with the
Winter
sniper, which I
Wonderland,
think
yeah.
is really awesome. You have the sequence at the car wash, which I think is great and intense. Then you have obviously the last act at the White House and in the Oval Office, and then I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, but they all stand out. Obviously, the Jesse Plemons sequence that we've mentioned many times. You have the refugee camp sequence. It's a little quieter. So I keep thinking about each individual scene, and I just think it's very well put together in each sequence. I feel like is memorable or has a great moment. That said, not without its faults, which we've brought up over and over again. But yeah, I just think that last act, like, it's exciting, don't get me wrong, like that storming the White House
And that's where
sequence
you're
and stuff like
projecting
that.
that, right? Where
um
you're projecting January
yeah,
6th onto
totally.
the visuals of it, or the killing of Osama bin Laden, right?
Yeah,
Where
absolutely.
those are the things that I think, a lot of people, whether they're right, left, or in the center, will see those images and be like, "Oh, is this referencing
Absolutely.
that war, or is that referencing that moment in history?" Because it does feel very contemporary in its references, even to the point at the beginning of the movie, we do see some archival footage of, various protests and riots, and some of which have been gathered through questionable sources, a couple of right-wing politics or pundits.
Yeah, there's some not great stuff with that and the AI imagery that they've been using in some of their marketing that I don't necessarily agree with. So we'll definitely flag that here. But
Yeah, you've been
yeah,
flagged, Alex Garland.
yeah, I like the relationships in the movie. Like I like that you mentioned the road trip kind of style of movie of having to, and obviously like dystopian road trip movies are, I feel like, very much my thing, or pieces of fiction. Like I'll bring up
Do you
The
love The
Last of Us
Road?
again and The Road, and yeah, there's lots of, like, it's very much my shit, which is I think why um I really dug this. But the relationships I thought were great, even though I don't love how it ends up. But like I like the Lee and Jesse relationship. I like Joel. I love Stephen McKinley Henderson. I thought he was
He's great.
great in this. He's wonderful. Like we talked about some of the emotion too, where his death I thought was very earned, and that sequence with Jesse Plemons where you're like, I don't know how the fuck they're gonna get out of this. um his sacrifice and him helping them, even though he tells them over and over again, don't do it, like, don't go, and like just his whole thing of them bringing him and him feeling old and that he can't keep up and things like that. Like I think that shit is done really well, and he's such a great character actor that, Sammy his death is more emotional than Lee's that happens at the end of the movie, right?
Because the
Because Lee's,
writing gets in the
yeah,
way.
exactly. It
Where
feels so,
Henderson really, well, he's a theater actor, right?
yeah,
And so Henderson is this like, ubiquitous character actor who mostly gets these bit roles. He was also recently in another A24 movie, Beau is Afraid, and amazing as Joaquin Phoenix's psychiatrist in that small
great in
scene.
Dune.
Obviously, the first Dune, Fences, pops up super briefly at the beginning of Manchester by the Sea. Always good, always, he's stoic, he's fatherly, he's educated, he brings so much dignity to the role, but he's also the smartest human being in this group of four.
Yeah,
And there's conversations about ageism and not being able to move the same way that the younger performers do, and the reporters, as you're in a war zone or something like that. But every conversation that he has, I think, could have easily become eye rolling in the way that the Dunst Spaney conversation was,
yeah,
but he delivers it in an almost anecdotal, kind of matter of fact way that doesn't feel like, oh, you're getting foreshadowing, but it is, because even the conversation he has about the Western forces at the beginning, the idea that California and Texas, which are strange bedfellows, decide to unite against the
an even
president
bigger
and
enemy. Yeah,
DC, because yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend,
yeah,
that old saying. And then Sammy says in at the beginning is that even if they succeed, as soon as they do, they'll be fighting again. They'll
yeah,
fight each other,
but
because even
yeah.
though that the movie ends with them killing the president and it's kind of like happy and a win, and that photograph also shows you another form of dehumanization.
I do like the use of photographs throughout the movie too.
Yes, yeah, but when you get to that moment, you realize this is a very short-lived
Oh yeah,
victory, because as soon as like the next day hits, those two states are going to be at each
yeah.
other
Of
again.
who is now trying to, yeah, and then you have obviously, they also have the loyalist states, which are loyalists to the president, correct? I think that
Yes.
was like, and then you have the New People's Army, which they don't really go into that much, which is like the northeastern states and stuff
Yeah,
like
and then
that. So,
Florida was kind of
oh,
in
Florida
the
alliance, yeah,
alliance, yeah,
yeah, with
which
the
kind of
southern
bridged,
states, yeah.
California and Texas together.
So you're
But
saying Texas isn't going to join up with the Florida alliance and try to take out the
well,
fucking
it might become like a
California?
wresling thing,
Yeah, yeah,
where like a wrestling storyline, comes into play, where, it was a temporary alliance, it was a convenience.
yeah,
And, both of these, states were threatened by a bigger force. So that's what you do. And then as soon as that force has been taken out, you fight over
yeah,
the power that's been left behind. And the other thing that I think this movie is very critical of, and I think Garland can't say that the movie's completely neutral, is that the film weirdly is critical of people being neutral or
yeah.
being removed from the war, ignoring it, or being ignorant to it.
That one town that they go
In
to,
West
right?
Virginia,
Yeah,
yeah. And so that scene is creepy, because it feels like, okay, well, in this little bubble, everything is normal, but it's not. You're
mhm.
denying it. And we've seen a lot of denial recently, whether it be with climate change or COVID.
COVID, yeah.
But Garland's always been interested in this, because there's conversations about Kaylee Spaney's parents and Dunt's parents as well, being sort of, not wanting to
They
have
just,
anything to
yeah,
do with it. Even, Garland's the first book that he wrote, and script with the beach, there's a sequence in that where one of the characters on this, idyllic island in Thailand is um injured, and the rest of the people on the island have to make a decision, because he's ruining the good times. And so what they decide to do is they just decide to cast him out and put him on the other side of the island, out of sight, out of mind, so they don't have to deal with it and worry about any responsibility. And so, like, that's something I think he has been always critical of, because you can see it in The Beach, and then you can see it here in Civil War. And when you're watching a movie like that, well, that's actually being very political, and that's taking a very strong critical stance against a certain type of
yeah,
behavior. Even
totally.
Casablanca, that's that's the whole, sort of point of that movie as well, is that Rick, Humphrey Bogart's character in Casablanca, is neutral. You can have allies and the Nazis come into the bar and
Sure.
everything is fine. It's neutral ground, but you really can't be neutral in a situation
Yeah.
where people are going to concentration camps.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah, and I think the movie does an okay job with that sometimes, using war photographers as that kind of metaphor, and journalists, right? Like of a journalist supposedly having to be neutral, but you're a human being. You you can't, as much as you're like, shit, I can't get involved. I just need to capture this. There are times, like, obviously, that we keep referencing the Jesse Plemons sequence is great, and just shout out to Jesse Plemons. What a guy who can play a dirtbag, who can play like a likable guy, and he can have 5 minutes of screen time and steal the movie, and he's just so fucking good. But
Well, he's also
um,
one of those guys where that character in Civil War, you could take that character and you could put him in Game Night.
sure,
It's so versatile in terms of
no, yeah,
how he performs this type of role, because you look at this character and I just have this feeling that any other actor in the role would have been maybe a little bit more cartoony or over
yeah,
the top or southern in their performance.
yeah,
But he's awful.
yeah.
He's a racist soldier, and you see what he and his other buddy have already done in killing and creating a mass grave. But the way that he plays it, it's so understated.
Yeah, it's so nonchalant.
And
Like, it's
that's what
just
makes it
that's
terrifying.
what he's good at, man. Like,
Yeah.
he's really good at just like, in Breaking Bad, the same way, where he was just he is so nonchalant in his delivery, or so casual with it all. It makes it so much more unnerving, like, in all of this stuff he's done. He's very good at that, but then he's also just good. He's just a good actor.
But
Like,
then,
he's a
like
really good actor.
Jungle Cruise, you look at
Yeah.
that movie, like he's so over the top, and it's not a great movie by any means, but he
But he's
makes
fun.
those
Yeah.
scenes that he's in.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think uh, a mixed bag a little bit, but I am still mixed pretty positive on the movie. I think, it is a visual kind of feast. It is unnerving, it's unsettling. It plays like a horror movie. If you yes, and maybe its message is a little muddled or surface level and things like that. Yes, it's a little overwrought where you kind of are rolling your eyes in that last act, but ultimately I still think it's quite good. It's very much my jam though. So like, if you follow along with like kind of my taste and stuff, I think you will dig this, and you've probably already seen it. But um, I'm gonna give the movie a 4 out of 5. So I think it's quite good, but I think it loses a little bit of being that like great, like that amazing kind of movie. So I'm gonna go with a 4 out of 5.
Yeah, I also am mixed positive because of the filmmaking, I think, is so strong. And the conversation, I think, is worth having. And
Yeah,
for those two reasons, and I also do really like Alex Garland as both a writer and director. And I think he does have a singular vision and is a very talented guy. And, having talked to him now 3 times, the thing I've always gotten from each conversation is that he's very self-deprecating, and he always gives credit to other people and never just himself, or barely himself, and realizes that the collaboration process is so important to making any movie. And you have to respect anybody that goes into that and knows that, okay, just
it's
because
not just me.
yeah, just because you wrote it or you're directing it
Or your name's on it. Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean it's all you. Because I've always had that weird sort of thing in my head when I see, when you're in the moment, but when you see someone win an award and they go up and they say, "Oh, thank you for watching my movie," or "I want to thank my crew," or something
Yeah.
like that. And Garland, even in the conversation that we had, mentions how, like, visionary director, and from the great mind of, like, all that is just marketing bullshit. And
Yeah.
it was just refreshing in that way to have that kind of conversation with him. And another quick thing that I think we should mention is his I think his music is underrated in a lot
Yeah.
of his movies, because
We didn't mention that. Thank you.
you look at Ex Machina, like the song "Get Down," it's Saturday Night, which is an amazing scene with Oscar Isaac. And then throughout his entire filmography, he takes songs that are, from specific eras and plays with them in a way that, could be over the top or, hit you on the head, but they have like a cool sense of irony to them. And even with this, you have, De La Soul in here. You have a lot of a couple of songs by Suicide, a
Yeah.
cover of a Bruce Springsteen song. And so I always think the music aspect of his movies are exciting to see. And if you have not watched Devs yet,
I need to,
please
man,
do,
but
because
I know.
there are a lot of Dev actors in this movie, in the main cast with Kaylee Spaney and Stephen McKinley Henderson, and also cameos throughout the film, and I feel like that truly is um, maybe his greatest work. Even though he's done, like, I think Ex Machina is my favorite film of his. I think Devs really sums him up perfectly as um, a voice or a visionary. And I know he doesn't probably will like this, but as a
Yeah.
visionary science fiction storyteller. And so with that, I'm giving Civil War 3.5 out of 5. It's so I even like aspects of Men. I don't think Men works completely, but I like that he was going with folk horror in that and sort of exchanging that from the science fiction aspect. But all of his films have one thing in common in terms of what he ultimately gets to. This is longer and obviously sort of more ambitious and um vast in terms of the set pieces, but it ends at the White House and it becomes a siege movie. Ex
Mhm.
Machina, single location, kind of a siege movie where you have, AI and humankind fighting over, what could be the next step in evolution. Annihilation, single location in a bubble that's been infected, aliens fighting for,
Mhm.
domination.
Dread.
With Dread, single location,
Yeah.
Men, all devs, all of these movies are very much of one mindset. And so like you can tell like he has things that he goes back to constantly.
Totally. So if he doesn't want to buy into the auteur thing, we'll place it on to him.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening or watching. We really, really do appreciate it. Please go check out our Letterboxd, where all of our reviews and videos and podcasts and ratings and everything which is Untitled underscore movies. Right? Or did we switch that?
I
I
have
don't.
no idea.
You know what? I'm at this point now where we've been. It's been the last year and a half has been a year and a half. It
It
is
sure
Untitled
has.
underscore movies. I know I changed one of them, but I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, Untitled underscore movies over on Letterboxd. And you can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric Marchin. You can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com. And please, if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, if you're watching this first, there's an interview with Alex Garland. Only had 7 minutes with him, but it was a really good conversation. And I think he brought some
Agreed.
really interesting things up to light with his collaboration process, the ethical nature of violence, and, just whether or not he sees himself as a director or writer first. And so, like, I'm really appreciative of the people over at Elevation Pictures for making that possible. And
You
on the
have a
social
couple,
media is at EM6211.
and you have a couple more interviews coming up. Plug those.
Yes. So I have an interview coming up with Caitlin Cronenberg for Humane. And I have an interview coming up with Radu Jude for Do Not Worry, or pardon me, Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World. Long title, but it's a fun conversation. So I'm excited for people to check those out.
You can check out our review for Godzilla Kong: The New Empire or X-Men 97. Both of those are up right now on this channel. And we'll have reviews for Cuckoo, the Dan Stevens, Hunter Schafer neon horror movie, as well as Challengers, the Luca Guadagnino tennis thriller. So
Tennis
I
thriller.
cannot wait to talk about that. So stay tuned for those. Those will be up soon, and I'm sure we'll be covering Planet of the Apes is coming soon. Deadpool is coming soon. We're getting into that summer movie season. So,
Furiosa. Will we talk
so
about Mad Max Fury Road and bring up those old wounds?
We will. We
Yeah.
will. So, will I watch Fury Road for like a 6th time giving it a shot? I don't know if I will, but I can't wait for that and more. So, thank you all. Until next time.
America.
Fuck yeah.